Another defense is infancy. Infancy applies to a case where the person, the defendant, is too young to be held criminally culpable. What that specific age is really depends on which state you're in. Some states set the age very low. We see ages such as 7 years old as being the cutoff, and other states like Pennsylvania seem to set it a little bit higher. Pennsylvania seems to say that it's 10 years old, and the reason I'm saying seems because there have been some cases that have argued that the age is really 14. I don't agree with that because we do have provisions in the Pennsylvania law where someone younger than 14 can be held criminally responsible for serious offenses such as murder below the age of 14. But generally speaking, someone who commits an offense who's under 14 in Pennsylvania, assuming it's not a serious offense like murder or rape or some other violent offense, is typically handled by the juvenile court and not treated through or not processed through the criminal court. So that's where that age difference is. But if we were looking for an absolute minimum age, it seems like Pennsylvania is 10 years old. So if we have someone who is under 10 or whatever the law is in your specific state, they cannot be charged with a criminal offense. Again, they can be processed through the juvenile courts, but they can't be handled through the criminal courts if they're under that age, because we conclude that a person under that age cannot really understand what they're doing and should not be held responsible. Another major defense is the insanity defense. Now, there are a lot of myths about the insanity defense. People think that defendants are using this defense every day and are winning on it every day and are getting off with crimes through some flimsy excuse. But we're going to find out through these next few slides that it's very, very hard to win an insanity defense, and often it's not to the benefit of the person arguing it. We'll often find that they serve more time in a confined mental health facility. It won't be a prison, but a mental health facility, than they will if they had just pled guilty and gone to prison. So it's not the benefit that everybody thinks it is. It's not, certainly not being argued very often. In fact, it's rarely, if ever, being argued. And it's, when it is argued, it's rarely successful. So there are only a small number of people each year who are actually, quote, winning on the insanity defense. Not nearly as many as the public believes. So it's rarely argued, rarely successful. And as you can see in this last paragraph in the PowerPoint, the defendants won't walk free if they're found not guilty by reason of insanity. They will be found not guilty. It's a complete defense. So if the jury finds that they are insane, they will be found not guilty. However, every state that has the insanity defense, and some states have abolished it, but in every state that has it, that defendant will then have mental health hearings and will be committed to a secure mental health facility. That's a nice word for a prison for people who have severe mental health issues. So they'll go to a location. It won't be a prison, but it'll be a mental health facility that has locks on the doors. Maybe they won't call the guards, but that's basically what they are. This person will not be able to walk freely away from the facility and be on their own in the community. They will be inside this secure facility receiving treatment more than just merely being placed in a cell as in a regular prison. So they'll receive a healthy dose of treatment, but they are going to be in a secure facility. They won't be out in the public. Likewise, when you read this paragraph in the PowerPoint, I indicate that they'll likely serve a longer time of confinement in that mental health facility than they would have if they were sentenced to jail or prison. This is because we're not going to allow them to leave the mental health facility until we feel that they're no longer a threat to themselves or to others. And so if you had committed let's say an assault, a serious assault, and you had won by reason of insanity, you might be confined to that mental health facility for years. But if you'd pled guilty, you might have only gotten months instead. So this is why many defendants who arguably are criminally insane do not argue the insanity defense. I should also point out that insanity is a legal term. It's not a psychological term. Psychiatrists do not have, if you look at the DSM, that is the manual for psychiatrists and psychologists, it includes all the diagnoses. You will not find any mention of the word insanity. Insanity is a legal term, not a psychological term. So when a psychiatrist comes to the trial and testifies, that psychiatrist will not be asked, do you believe this defendant is insane? That is not within their expertise. They will talk about the defendant's behavior. They will talk about whether it fits into a particular diagnosis, but they will not declare whether the person is insane or not. That's a decision for the judge and the jury. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries, we've developed some tests for insanity. The oldest test is the Macnaghten rule. This rule comes from England. Macnaghten was a man who thought that the Prime Minister of England in the 1800s was plotting to do harm to him or to others, and so he decided that the best course was to kill the Prime Minister. Well, he was unsuccessful in his attempt to kill the Prime Minister, but he did kill one of the Prime Minister's secretaries. He went to court, and his lawyers argued that he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know right from wrong. In his skewed view of the world, it was imperative for him to kill the Prime Minister. He truly believed he was doing good for society by killing the Prime Minister. So his lawyers argued because he didn't know right from wrong, we should not punish him. And the English courts agreed. So we still have this rule. Pennsylvania uses this rule in its jurisdiction. It's perhaps the most difficult insanity test to meet. What does it include? Well, one statement of the Macnaghten rule is, you can read it along with me, at the time of the committing of the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason from a disease of the mind as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know he was doing what was wrong. Now, in plainer English, what does this boil down to? We often call this the right from wrong test. A person is insane if they have basically no clue of what they were doing. So if they were completely unaware, they had no understanding of what they were doing at the time. So in essence, they were pretty much out of it, completely out of it. If they can show that they were completely unaware of what they were doing at the time they were acting, then we can find them to be not guilty by reason of insanity. Or if they did know what they were doing, but they didn't know it was wrong, and that would be like Macnaghten when he thought that he was doing right by trying to kill the Prime Minister. So if they didn't know right from wrong, then they can be found not guilty by reason of insanity. So they either don't know what they're doing or they don't know right from wrong. If they can establish this, then they can be found not guilty by reason of insanity under the Macnaghten rule. Back, we had someone who was a pyromaniac, someone who had a disease that just compelled them to light fires. They may know it's wrong to set something on fire, but they don't have the ability to stop themselves. It's an irresistible impulse. As much as they would like to stop, they can't. So maybe they're a kleptomaniac. There's someone who can't control themselves from stealing. They just have to steal. So if we can show that their crime, if they stole something, or if they're a pyromaniac and they committed arson, if we can show that they could not control their behavior because of this mental defect and this irresistible impulse, then they should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. A test that we see in about half of the jurisdictions in the United States is the Model Penal Code or Substantial Capacity Test. And this one is very similar to the Macnaghten rule, but it also incorporates the irresistible impulse into it as well. So it's as we often see with the Model Penal Code, it combines existing tests. And so for the Model Penal Code Substantial Capacity Test, a person will be found not guilty by reason of insanity if he lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. So, in plainer English, once again, like the McNaughton rule, he will be found not guilty by reason of insanity if he doesn't understand right from wrong. But unlike the McNaughton rule, he doesn't have to be completely unaware of right from wrong. Here, he lacks substantial capacity. So, in this case, it's a little bit easier to prove insanity because we're saying that substantially you were out of it. You didn't know right from wrong. But you could still have an inkling that what you were doing was wrong. So you're mostly unaware of right from wrong, but you don't have to be completely unaware like in the McNaughton rule. So that may seem like a slight difference, but it is an important difference. The person could have a little bit of an understanding that what they were doing was wrong, but substantially they didn't understand right from wrong. Under the McNaughton rule, you have to have no awareness of right from wrong. The second part of the substantial capacity test is like the irresistible impulse test. They were unable to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. In other words, they couldn't control their behavior. So they lacked substantial capacity to control their behavior. So this is why we call it the substantial capacity test, because you're mostly unable to control what you're doing. One other test that's not used anywhere, was only upheld by one court, was the Durham rule. And even that court no longer uses it. But the Durham rule only asks, was the action of the defendant the product of a mental disease? So we don't have to prove that you were substantially unaware. We don't have to prove that you were substantially unable to conform your behavior to the law. All we're asking is, did you have a mental disease? Was this crime a product of that mental disease? And so this gives a lot of deference to psychiatrists and psychologists, but courts usually don't trust psychiatrists and psychologists to a great extent. And so people felt this would open the doors to lots of defendants pleading guilty, because everyone probably has some kind of illness, some kind of mental health illness or disability. And so this one is no longer in place in states. Finally, we need to talk about John Hinckley, because he's an important person in the development and evolution of the insanity defense. John Hinckley tried to kill President Reagan in 1981. He was unsuccessful, but he did shoot Reagan, wound him, and 3 other people. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity. And even though there was film of him shooting the president, the whole assassination attempt was caught on video, nonetheless the jury did return a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict, and the public reacted with outrage, saying, how could this happen? As a result, some states abolished the insanity defense, but more states created another kind of verdict for the jury. These states still retained the insanity defense, but they gave the jury the option of finding the person guilty but mentally ill. And so what this verdict does is, if we don't think the person was fully insane under those tests that we just mentioned, but we think they really did have a mental health issue and that perhaps they should receive treatment rather than prison, then the jury can come back with a guilty but mentally ill, a GBMI, a guilty but mentally ill verdict. And this basically tells the judge, we don't think the person's insane, but we do think they have a mental illness, and so consider that when you're sentencing the person. Pennsylvania has a guilty but mentally ill verdict. And so Hinckley is an important figure in the history of the insanity defense. Again, he attempted to assassinate President Reagan. He stayed in a secure facility until just this past year. In 2016, he was finally released after serving 35 years. Wasn't really serving, but being held for 35 years in a secure mental health facility. After 35 years, they finally felt he was no longer a danger to society, and they were able to release him.